Welcome to AP Psychology, the prologue, the story of psychology. As the science and behavior of mental processes, psychology traces its roots back to the early recorded history when scholars reflected on the relationship between mind and body. Psychologists' initial focus on the mind's structure was later replaced by the study of its functions. As the science of behavior and mental processes, psychology has its origins in many disciplines and countries. Psychologists' most enduring issue concerns the relative contributions of biology and experience. Today, psychologists recognize that nurture works on the nature endows. Biopsychosocial approach incorporates biological, psychological, and social cultural levels of analysis, and although different perspectives on human nature have their own purposes and questions, they are complementary and provide a further understanding of mind and behavior. Some psychologists conduct applied research, others provide professional services, including assessing and treating troubled people, with its perspective ranging from the biological to the social, and settings from the clinic to the laboratory. Psychology has become a meeting place for many disciplines. Mastering psychology requires active study. A survey question, read, recite, review, study method boosts students' learning performance. Psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. As a science, psychology evaluates competing claims with systematic observation and rigorous analysis. Behavior is anything an organism does. Mental processes are internal, subjective experiences we infer from brief behavior, for example, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. In their attempt to understand human nature, early scholars explained how our minds work and our bodies relate to our minds. In India, Buddha wondered how sensations and perceptions combine to form ideas. In China, Confucius stressed the power of ideas and the importance of an educated mind. In their attempt to understand human nature, early scholars examined how our minds work and how their bodies relate to our minds. Buddha and Confucius focused on the power and origin of ideas. Hebrew scriptures linked mind and emotion to the body. Socrates and Plato viewed mind as separate from the body and argued that some ideas are innate. Socrates and Plato viewed mind as separable from the body and argued that some ideas are innate. In contrast, Aristotle maintained that knowledge grows from our experience and believed that the mind and body are connected. He derived principles from careful observations, and in the 1600s, the Frenchman René Descartes agreed with Socrates and Plato regarding the existence of inborn knowledge and the mind's being entirely distinct from the body and able to survive its death. In contrast, Aristotle maintained the knowledge grows from our experience and believed that the mind and body are connected. He derived principles from careful observations. Aristotle gave history first fully integrated and systematic account of psychology. Within surviving works can be found theories of learning, memory and perception, motivation and emotion, and socialization, personality. A son of a court physician, Aristotle was affluent by birth. Still, he was an extraordinarily hard worker who spared nothing in his pursuit of knowledge. Because medical knowledge was traditionally passed from father to son, Aristotle learned much about biology. This likely fostered a strong scientific empirical perspective. Obviously, Aristotle was often wrong. For example, he claimed mice die if they drink in the summertime, that eels are generated spontaneously, and that humans have only 8 ribs, and that men have more teeth than women. He also thought that the mind must be the heart, because people can recover from head injuries while wounds to the heart are always fatal. The brain's function? For Aristotle, it was to cool the blood when it becomes overly warm. Aristotle anticipated modern science in his insistence that sense perceptions are the essential raw materials of knowledge. Direct observation, he claimed, is the foundation of understanding. In admitting that he did not know how bees procreate, he wrote, "The facts have not been sufficiently established. If ever they are, then credit must be given to observation rather than to theories, and to theories only insofar as they are confirmed by observed facts." Aristotle valued not only deductive reasoning and formal logic, but also inductive reasoning, that is, using observed cases or examples to arrive at generalizations. For Aristotle, neither the soul nor the psyche, the thinking part of the soul, can exist apart from the body. Clearly, he was a monist. In describing how the mind uses both inductive and deductive reasoning to arrive at knowledge, he provided, according to Robert Watson, the first functional view of mental processes. Our minds, argued Aristotle, note the similarities in a series of objects, and form those commonalities form a universal, a word, or a concept representing not an actual thing, but a general principle. This provides the avenue to higher levels of knowledge and wisdom. Thus, reason is an active, organizing process that acts upon sense data. His description of thought, and especially of the steps taken in thinking, sounds as if he based it on laboratory findings. He had none, of course, but being so diligent a collector of biological specimens, he may well have done something analogous. That is, scrutinized his own experiences and those of others, treating them as specimens on which he based his generalizations. Aristotle also formulated a theory of motivation in terms of pleasure and pain, described drives that produce various kinds of behavior, such as courage, friendship, and temperance, and even outlined a theory of catharsis to explain our emotional experience of observing theatrical tragedy. Robert Watson concludes that the study of Aristotle is rewarded by a feeling of wonder at the modernity of much of what he says about psychological matters. He was, of course, wrong in many of his facts, and he admitted important topics, but his overall framework for the growing, sensing, and remembering, desiring, reacting, and thinking, with but few changes, bears more than a resemblance to modern psychology. Descartes, like Plato, believed in the soul, the mind, the body, and separation, but wondered how the immaterial mind and physical body communicated. In the 1600s, the Frenchman René Descartes, regarding the existence of inborn knowledge in the minds being entirely distinct from body, and thus was able to survive death. In Britain, Francis Bacon, one of the founders of modern science, anticipated later discoveries regarding the human mind. Bacon is one of the founders of modern science, particularly the experimental method. British philosopher John Locke argued that at birth the mind is a blank slate at which experience writes. This idea helped formed modern empiricism, the view that knowledge originates in experience, and thus the science should rely on observation and experimentation. Well, Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychological laboratory in 1879 in Leipzig, Germany. He sought to measure the fastest, simplest mental processes. His student, Edward Titchener, introduced the school of structuralism, which used introspection to search for the basic elements of the mind. However, self-reports proved somewhat unreliable, varying from person to person and from situation to situation. William James thought it more fruitful to study how consciousness serves a purpose, and thus functionalism focused on how mental and behavioral processes enable the organism to adapt, survive, and flourish. James also wrote a textbook for the new discipline, psychology. He mentored Mary Whiton Calkins, the first female president of the APA, and Margaret Floy Washburn, the second female president of the American Psychological Association. William James is one of the most important and intriguing figures in the history of American psychology. James, the first psychology professor at American University, Harvard, began teaching the subject in 1875. Within 2 decades, psychology was taught at 24 universities. 3 psychology journals were being published, and a professional psychology society had been founded. James introduced experimental psychology to the United States. Although James recognized the value of experimentation, he found it boring and spent no more than 2 days a week in the laboratory. Sometimes he even disavowed the label of psychologist. He told a friend, "I naturally hate experimental work," referring to Wundt's laboratory work. He lamented the thought of psychophysical experimentation, and altogether of brass instrument and algebraic psychology fills me with horror. Nonetheless, he accepted its value, and his students conducted a wide variety of experiments. Moreover, he forced himself to do it when he was convinced it was the best way to prove or disprove a theory. For example, he used himself as a subject in testing the ancient belief that memory, like a muscle, can be strengthened through exercise. In a series of memory exercises, he found that exercise actually diminished, at least temporarily, the strength of his memory. It took James 12 years to complete the first textbook in psychology. The mammoth work, nearly 1,400 pages in 2 volumes, could hardly be used in the classroom. James quickly turned out an abridged version. The full-length version was known as the James, and the abridgment was referred to as the Jimmy. In 1894, James was the first American to call attention to Sigmund Freud, and in 1909 he met Freud at Clark University during a psychoanalyst-only visit to the United States. In contrast to Freud, James avoided creating a theoretical system, founded no school, and trained few graduate students, and had no school of followers. While he has said something about every topic in psychology, the following 6 ideas constituted his chief influence. Functionalism. Number 1. For James, the proper study of psychology was the introspective analysis of the states of mind. We are conscious of everyday life and of functions. They perform for us. He thought that the mind's process had evolved because of their life-preserving functions. Thus, to understand these complex processes, we needed to know what functions they perform. We should not view functionalism as a system. Indeed, James deliberately avoided presenting his ideas as a coherent whole because he thought it was far too early in the history of the discipline for any grand theory. The nature of mind. James examined every solution to the mind-body problem and found none to be satisfactory. He thought psychologists should lay aside the whole mind-body problem because the discipline was not ready or able to articulate the connection between psychological states and mental states. Rather, for the present, its proper concern should be the description and explanation of such processes as reasoning, attention, will, imagination, memory, and feelings. James' suggestion would become dominant view within many branches of psychology. 3. The stream of thought. Using introspection as the major approach to the mind, James argued that his results pointed to an unbroken flow of complex conscious thought. Each person's consciousness is a continuum, not a series of linked experiences or thoughts. Although the object of our thoughts or perceptions may seem distinct and separate, our awareness of them forms a river or stream, the best metaphor for consciousness. Number 4, the self. The self, James suggested that the belief in the distinct principle of selfhood was an essential part of common sense of mankind. Thoughts are not merely thoughts. They are my or your thoughts. The perception of personal identity arises from the continuity of the stream of consciousness. From moment to moment, from day to day, I know that I am the same that I was a moment ago, a day ago, a decade ago. These feelings and acts associated with them can be studied and thus constitute empirical self. Number 5, will. Some observers suggest that James was not a valuable contribution to Some observers suggest that James' most valuable contribution to psychology was his theory of will, the conscious process that directs voluntary movements. Our vast supply of information and experience in achieving desired ends is what leads us to will and acts in the first place. Sometimes we act unhesitatingly, and at other times choosing which idea to ignore and which to attend to become the act of willing. The choice can be instantaneous or the result of long deliberation and reasoning. To believe in the complete determination thought, James would make the passive and powerless. The belief in free will allows us to consider alternatives, to plan, and finally to act on our plans. The unconscious, number 6, although James was primarily concerned with conscious mental life, he carefully distinguished between those acts that we perform by consciously commanding muscular movements and other acts that have been practiced and thus have been automatic. We walk, climb steps, and dress without thinking of necessary movements, James wrote. Its general principle in psychology, the consciousness deserts all processes where we can no longer be of use. We do better without thinking of the movements required. In this, James anticipated contemporary research in which complex voluntary movements such as piano playing, driving become overlearned and are largely carried out unconsciously. In contrast to Freud, James did not see the unconscious as the mind's way of banishing unacceptable sexual drives from awareness. Number 7, emotion. James' theory of emotion was revolutionary, and the James Lang theory that will be discussed in chapter 13 is highly regarded in psychology. This minor theory led to far more research than any of James' other ideas. James argued that emotion we feel is not what causes bodily symptoms such as racing heart or sweaty palms. Instead, the nervous system reacting to an external stimulus produces those physical symptoms, and our perception of them is what constitutes the emotion. With these ideas, James transformed an abstract science into discipline that spoke directly to personal interests and concerns. James also influenced psychology in 2 other practical ways. He suggested application of psychological principles to teaching became the core educational philosophy. He suggested applications of psychological principles to teaching became the core of educational psychology. In addition, James succeeded in convincing the Rockefeller Foundation and other groups to allocate millions of dollars to the mental hygiene movement, the establishment of mental hospitals, and training of mental health professionals. Psychology developed from the established fields of philosophy and biology, and its pioneers included the Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov, Austrian personality theorist Sigmund Freud, and Swiss biologist Jean Piaget. Until the 1920s, psychology was defined as the science of mental life. Sigmund Freud and his followers emphasized the importance of the unconscious mind and its effects and its behavior. From the 1920s through the 1960s, American psychologists led by John Watson and later B.F. Skinner redefined psychology as the science of observable behavior. In the 1960s, psychology began to recapture its interest in mental processes, and today is defined as the scientific study of mental processes. John Watson in 1913 and later B.F. Skinner emphasized the study of overt behavior as the subject matter of scientific psychology. Maslow and Rogers emphasized current environmental influences on our growth and potential and our need for love and acceptance, and developed a new field known as humanistic psychology. Today, we define psychology as the scientific study of behavior, what we do, and mental processes, the inner thoughts and feelings. Psychology developed from more established fields in philosophy and biology. Its pioneers included Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, Austrian personality theorist Sigmund Freud, and biologist Jean Piaget. Until the 1920s, psychology was defined as the science of mental life. From 1920s through 1960s, American psychologists led by John Watson and later B.F. Skinner redefined psychology as the science of observable behavior. In the 1960s, psychology began to recapture its interest in mental process and is defined as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Psychology's biggest and most enduring debate concerns the nature versus nurture issue. American Psychological Association is the largest of psychology with 160,000 members worldwide, followed by British Psychological Society with 34,000 members. Darwin stated that nature selects those that best enable the organism to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. The controversy over the relative contributions of genes and experience to the development of psychological traits and behavior included in the history of this debate is Charles' concept of natural selection, which states that among the range of inherited trait variations, those contributing to reproduction and survival will most likely be passed on to succeeding generations. Evolution has become an important principle for the 21st century psychology. Today, contemporary science recognizes that nurture works on what nature endows. Our species is biologically endowed with an enormous capacity to learn and to adapt. Moreover, every psychological event is simultaneously a biological event. Psychology's current perspectives in neuroscience is how the body and brain enables emotions, the sample question would be how our message is transmitted in the body, and how is blood chemistry linked with moods and motives. Evolutionary psychology focus is how the natural selection of traits promotes the perpetuation of one's genes. Sample questions would be how does evolution influence our behavior tendencies? Behavior genetics is how much our genes and our environment influence our individual differences. The questions we would ask is to what extent are psychological traits such as intelligence, personality, sexual orientation, vulnerability to depression attributed to our genes or into our environment. The psychodynamic perspective focuses on how behavior springs from unconscious drives and conflicts. Questions in the psychodynamic zone would be: how can someone's personality traits and disorders be explained in terms of sexual aggressive drives or as disguised effects of unfulfilled wishes and childhood trauma? The behavioral perspective is how we learn observable responses. How do we learn to fear particular objects or situation? What is the most effective way to alter our behavior, say to lose weight or quit smoking? The cognitive perspective is how we encode, process, and store and retrieve information. Sample questions would be: how do we use information in remembering, reasoning, and problem solving? Social cultural perspective focuses how behavior thinking vary across situations and cultures. A sample question would be: how are we as Africans, Asians, Australians, or North Americans alike as members of the human family? As products of different environmental contexts, how do we differ? Biological subfields. Biological, we explore the links between brain and mind. Developmental, we study changing abilities from womb to tomb. Cognitive is we study how we perceive, think, and solve problems. Personality is we investigate our persistent traits. And social is how we explore how we view and affect one another. The different systems that make up complex human systems suggest different levels of analysis: biological, psychological, social, cultural. Together, these levels are integrated from an integrated biopsychosocial approach. Psychology varied perspectives, therefore, complement each other. Someone working from evolutionary perspective considers how evolution influences behavior tendencies. Behavior genetics perspective considers how evolution influences behavior tendencies. Neuroscience perspective studies how the body and brain work to create emotions, memory, and sensory experiences. Psychodynamic perspective views behavior as springing from unconscious drives and conflicts. Behavioral perspective examines how observable responses are required and changed. Cognitive perspective studies how we encode, processes, store, and retrieve information. Social cultural perspective examines how behavior and thinking vary with the situation. Research on the obesity effectively illustrates both the importance and complementary nature of the psychology's levels of analysis. Biological, psychological, and social factors all contribute to the understanding of what has rapidly become the #1 health threat in the United States. 2/3 of American adults are considered overweight, and almost half of them obese, double the rate of 40 years ago. Moreover, it is becoming a global problem. Economist Barry Popkins states, in a very short time, many low and middle income countries have attained rates of overweight and obesity greater than or equal to those in the USA and Europe. The biology of obesity questions the notion that being overweight is only a matter of weak will. Evolutionary psychologists observed that getting fat is an evolutionary advantage. Early humans who could best store energy when food was abundant for use in lean times survived to pass down their genes. Psychologist Paul Rosen notes that we're hardwired to spend as little energy as possible. A general rule that animals follow is to do this little as you can to do what you have to do. They try to get more calories but use up the fewest calories getting them. Recent studies of adoptees and twins indicate the genetic influence on body weight. Identical twins have very similar weights even when reared apart. Genetic influences the size of fat cells that determine one's body weight. Obese people's weight thermostats are set higher. When their weight drops below the set point, the hunger increases and metabolism decreases. A variety of psychological factors also contribute to obesity. Our eyes rule our bellies, suggests Barbara J. Rolls of Pennsylvania State University, partly because we are told to clean our plate when young. Three-year-olds, she reported, tend to stop eating when they are full. However, when she served adults macaroni and cheese on 4 different days, the larger the portions, the more they ate, despite the fact that they all reported similar levels of satiety. Similarly, she reported adults ate twice as many M&Ms from a jumbo package than from a small one, as well as potato chips from a bigger bag than from a smaller one. It's also clear that when people are given more variety, they eat more. Our feelings, too, lead to overeating. For those who are consciously restraining their eating, feeling anxious or depressed can unleash the urge to eat. And once a diet is broken, the person often concludes that what the heck, and binges. Finally, the social cultural factors contribute to overeating. Paul Rosen notes that America is a culture of bigness. When someone comes to your house, the worst thing you can do is not give them enough food. The French would be more concerned about giving them food of high quality. Compared to the French, Americans eat more, enjoy it less, usually hurrying through meals. Even in fast food outlets, the French eat more slowly. Kelly Brownwell of the Yale University labels our current social setting a toxic environment of food. Unhealthy food is highly accessible. It's convenient, it's engineered to taste good, and it's heavily promoted, and it's inexpensive. If you wanted to engineer a good food environment, you'd have to reverse of all that. Brownwell notes that both the politics and economics of agriculture encourage overproduction of food, which then has to be marketed. You sell the food by sweetening it, by offering it in large portions, and promoting it very heavily. Clearly, biological, psychological, and social cultural influences are all important to understanding this major health threat. They supplement one another, with each shedding important light on obesity. The different levels of analysis are not competing but complementary because, as quoted in the text, everything is related to everything else. Some psychologists conduct basic research. For example, biological psychologists explore the link between brain and behavior. Developmental psychologists study our changing abilities from womb to tomb. And personality psychologists investigate our inner traits. Other psychologists conduct applied research. For example, industrial organizational psychologists study behavior in the workplace and suggest ways of improving conditions and performance. Psychology is also a helping profession. Counseling psychologists assist people with problems in living and achieving greater well-being. Clinical psychology involves mental health professionals who study and assess and treat people with psychological disorders. Psychiatry sometimes involves medical treatment as well as psychological therapy. Psychology relates to many disciplines by connecting the fields ranging from mathematics to philosophy and by aiding those disciplines. The emergence of the interdisciplinary field of social cognitive neuroscience demonstrates not only contemporary nature of psychology's perspective, but also how some scientists are trying to integrate them. As Kevin Ochsner and Matthew Lieberman report, the first meeting devoted to social cognitive neuroscience held in April 2001 was attended by social psychologists, cognitive neuroscientists, as well as clinical psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, and political scientists. Social cognitive neuroscience attempts to understand the phenomena in terms of interactions among three levels of analysis. The social level, which deals with the social environmental factors that influence behavior and experience. The cognitive level, which is concerned with the information processing mechanisms that give rise to social level of phenomena. And the neural level, which is concerned with the brain mechanisms that underlie cognitive levels processes. The social cognitive neuroscience approach involves conducting studies and constructing theories that make reference to all three levels. One of the field's important assumptions is that the different questions asked at varying levels of analysis are not independent or mutually exclusive, but can serve to enrich one another. Recent studies of stereotyping demonstrate this approach. Stereotypes involve categorical judgments about a social group. They influence people's beliefs and expectations about the group members, which in turn bias perception processes. For example, if a white man possesses a negative stereotype toward blacks, he is likely to automatically perceive ambiguous signals from a black man as being more dangerous, less friendly, or less competent. Neuroimaging can provide important insights into the process by which stereotyping occurs. By revealing whether the same brain regions are involved in affective, cognitive, and behavioral components of stereotyping. There may be as many kinds of stereotypes as there are kinds of knowledge of systems in the brain. In one of the first studies of stereotyping and the brain, researchers examined how perception of the outgroup members differs from perception of in-group members. The study used functional magnetic resonance imaging to compare the amygdala activation in both white and black participants exposed to unfamiliar white and black faces. In the first block of trials, participants judged the gender of each face. The researchers found the amygdala activation to both in-group and out-group faces among both white and black participants. In the second block of trials, however, the amygdala response to in-group faces habituated, whereas the response to out-group faces did not. One interpretation is that unfamiliar faces, whatever their group relation, are ambiguous and potentially threatening when first seen. Presumably, this threat response to in-group faces habituates because of the extensive prior experience with members of the in-group. In an extension of the study, researchers found significant correlation between the amygdala activity in response to black faces and the amount of implicit anti-black racial bias shown on the reaction time measure administered a few days before. However, this correlation was not found for famous and therefore familiar black faces, such as Michael Jordan. This result fits the claim that whites automatically perceive unfamiliar black faces as potentially threatening and fear relevant. Consistent with this notion was the finding that the amygdala activation to famous black faces did not correlate with an explicit measure of racial prejudice. All right, so to master information, one must actively process it. People learn and remember material best when they put it in their own words, rehearse it, and then review and rehearse it again. An acronym for survey, question, read, recite, review is SQ3R. This is a study method that encourages active processing of new information, distributing study time. Listening actively in class, overlearning, focusing on big ideas, and being a smart test taker will boost learning and performance. So we suggest that you use the survey, question, read, review, reflect, SQ3R method. Survey what you're about to read, including chapter outlines and section headings. Question, ask questions, make notes. Read, make sure you read outlines, sections, and chapters in their entirety. Review margin definitions, study learning outcomes, reflect on what you learned, and test yourself with quizzes. As the text indicates, psychology continues to grow and expand around the world. The numbers of both psychologists and students studying psychology are increasing rapidly. At the same time, psychology faces severe challenges to its international development. Among them are the following. First, psychology faces increased demands for accountability. Sciences in general and psychology in particular are called on to demonstrate their relevance and thereby merit continued financial and social support. Proponents of particular methods of treatment and prevention are being asked to demonstrate their effectiveness. To answer this later question, the APA's Division of Clinical Psychology helped organize a series of meetings that produced an excellent book, A Guide to Treatments That Work. The question of ethics and treatment of research participants and delivery of psychology services is another dimension of the accountability issue. Ethical standards vary widely. Examination of the codes in different countries may eventually help psychological organizations derive core ethical values that hold across the world. Second, psychology must reach beyond laboratories and clinics. In applying its science more broadly, specifically, Rosenzweig suggests psychology's initiatives are needed to aid expanding populations to live in harmony and thus avoid ethnic conflicts that rage in many parts of the world today. At present, the number of psychologists involved in addressing such problems is small. Establishing an interdisciplinary teams to which psychology make its unique contribution may be an important first step. Clearly, the aspects of psychology that apply to such social problems must be supported and developed. Third, psychology needs to gain the appropriate classification among the disciplines. Presently, psychology is classified in a variety of ways depending on the country, and even that classification varies among universities within a given country. Psychology is most frequently classified as a social science. In some countries, particularly in Europe, psychology is classified in both the social science and the humanities. The classification as a humanity helps explain why some European psychologists report difficulty in obtaining research funding and space in the United States and Canada. Psychology is often in the United States and Canada, psychology is often classified as a biological and social science or in the class of its own, but not in the humanities. Classification is important for stable relations with other sciences and for obtaining research support both within the universities and for external sources. Fourth, psychology must resolve how it will participate in and help meet the needs of knowledge society. Psychology must take steps to participate fully in the electronic communication channels that make possible a new kind of world science. Other natural sciences seem to be ahead of psychology in terms of organized data banking. Although psychologists in many countries have gained access to the internet, others find such access limited and expensive. In this way, technological advances are widening the gap between industrial and developing countries. Rosenzweig concludes that finding ways to bridge this gap is essential for the full international development of psychology. This completes the prologue, which is our first unit in AP Psychology.